The generals of the Russian Federation promised Kremlin leader Putin to capture Kupiansk and Pokrovsk, but they were unable to carry out the order.
Putin gave the order to capture them completely by mid-October, actually by November. By the way, the deadline was originally set for October 15th, but they failed to meet it. Now, the next order is to capture Pokrovsk, Mirnohrad, and Kostiantynivka by mid-November. Otherwise, it seems there will be consequences for their ranks and even their heads. At the very least, this concerns the Chief of the General Staff and the generals of the General Staff.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced a complete clearing of Kupiansk and the Kharkiv region from the occupiers.
Up to 60 Russians remain in Kupiansk. The clearing operation is underway. We will clear everything out, we know. Basically, the dates have been set. They were at the headquarters. We won't be sharing this kind of information for now.
The Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation urgently prepared a response. Supposedly, the Russians are advancing in the city.
The head of the Kiev regime has completely lost touch with reality and, listening to Syrskyi's false reports, is absolutely unaware of the actual situation on the ground. Or on the contrary, he understands the hopelessness of the situation and the real position of the Ukrainian armed forces in Kupiansk. A few
days before this, Putin once again reported on successes near Kupiansk. The chief of the Russian General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, falsely reported to the Kremlin dictator that Russian troops had completed the encirclement of Ukrainian forces.
Your fellow soldiers and comrades in arms are advancing forward on all fronts in a coordinated effort.
However, Ukrainian forces held their positions despite the enemy shelling the crossings and attempting to break through the defenses.
The strong and persistent desire to seize and control as much territory as possible in the Donbas region is specifically meant to demonstrate and make it clear that they are actively carrying out the so-called special military operation, as well as fulfilling their stated function and responsibilities.
Ukrainian units have already managed to regain control over part of the built-up area in the city. A military operation by Ukrainian forces is underway, aiming to cut off the enemy's supply routes and clear the city. Several units are taking part in it.
We destroy them, but their numbers do not decrease. That is, they keep bringing in new ones. Another sabotage group comes through. These saboteurs generally avoid direct clashes with our servicemen, at least in part because they do not have enough weapons and ammunition with them to engage in a fight.
Ukrainian units have already managed to regain control over part of the built-up area in the city. A military operation by Ukrainian forces is underway, aiming to cut off the enemy's supply routes and clear the city. Several units are taking part in it. In September, Russian occupiers managed to break into Kupiansk through a pipeline. Against this backdrop, the situation around the city has escalated. Now, however, the occupiers are trying to enter the city disguised as civilians. When Ukrainian forces manage to completely cut off the supply routes and finish clearing Kupiansk, it will complicate the logistics of Russian units in this sector and may reduce their operational mobility. It took the Russian Federation's army 21 months to advance just 39 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. Ukrainian forces continue their defensive efforts in the Pokrovsk direction.
The soldiers often have to walk to their positions because traveling by vehicle has become too dangerous.
Russian troops continue their active offensive toward Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region.
The Russians are trying to act covertly, approaching our positions through tree lines. We managed to detect the enemy and destroy them. In
Pokrovsk itself, it is difficult to conduct combat operations using vehicles since the city is filled with anti-tank hedgehogs and concrete triangles. For the most part, the enemy's infantry uses motorcycles and buggies.
The ability to infiltrate further in Kupiansk, they practically have none. Certain measures have been taken there to prevent this from happening, and their numbers are not increasing but are gradually decreasing. Our groups have been sent there. These are not necessarily from the main intelligence directorate or the security service.
According to the media, the Russians have concentrated a 170,000-strong army on this section of the front.
They are clearing out those sabotage groups that managed to infiltrate into the city between our firing positions. We need to understand that the front line is just a line on the map, but in the field on the ground, it's firing positions. And there is a certain distance between them, which saboteurs can slip through.
What complicates the defense of the city is that the occupiers from the Russian Federation entered Pokrovsk in civilian clothes, just like they did in Kupiansk. The Russians gathered in the city disguised as civilians and then began combat operations.
The groups used by the Russians consist of 2 to 3 people. At night or by using the terrain, they can sneak through.
The defense forces managed to replenish their supplies, reinforce their units, and stop the enemy's attempts to cut off the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad highway.
The air assault forces, marines and mechanized brigades are currently the main barrier for the Russians in the Pokrovsk direction, but everyone is doing a great job. In
recent days, the armed forces of the Russian Federation have had no successes in Pokrovsk. In total, there are 260 to 300 Russian servicemen in the city.
about 30% of all combat actions on the front are taking place in Pokrovsk. At the same time, 50% of Russia's use of Kabis is directed at Pokrovsk. There are currently 260 people in the city, 300 Russians.
The situation in the Kupiansk and Pokrovsk directions remains dynamic. The fighting continues. The Russian army is suffering simply enormous losses in the Pokrovsk direction. Hundreds killed in just this area in a single day. Reports and local publications show a large number of dead in the built-up areas and tree lines.
The term occupiers refers to people or groups who take control of a place, building, or territory, often without having the legal right or official permission to do so.
Russia has allocated an astonishing amount of manpower and resources to capture this city.
To hold their ground, they need something to fight with. But what do they have to fight with if last year they had maybe 10, maybe 20 Rashpavkas, well, 30 at most, and that's it. And that's only enough for a few hours of fighting. They've blocked the possibility for such groups to enter Kupin. They've tightened, let's say, the control. And those who remain, well, they're basically doomed where they are. If they want to save their lives, it would be better for them to surrender, because otherwise they will be destroyed.
Despite enormous losses, Russian commanders continue to launch assaults in waves. They don't care about the lives of their own soldiers. All just to please Putin and present any kind of advance as a victory.
The Ukrainian armed forces are advancing against the enemy in giant strides, at least by Kremlin standards. While Putin's army spends months fighting for every village, our defenders manage what seems impossible, recapturing as many as 3 Ukrainian villages from the Russian army in just one day. We're talking about the settlement of Sukitskoye and 2 more villages in the Pokrovsk direction, Kucherivyar and Uyut.
Thus, as of August 21st, 2025, the situation in this area has been stabilized. Control has been restored over 9 settlements. Another 9 have been cleared of enemy sabotage groups. In just the last 10 days, 1,756 enemy soldiers and 75 pieces of enemy equipment have been destroyed here.
The occupiers also suffered huge losses while trying to break through the Ukrainian front line on a neighboring section of the front line. Thus, the soldiers of the 33rd Brigade repelled a massive mechanized assault near Vladimirovka in the Donetsk region. During the battle, the weather conditions were poor, which did not work in the occupiers' favor. The enemy got at least 3 armored vehicles stuck in the swamp, and the infantry that began to disembark from them came under fire from artillery drones. At one point, even a HIMARS joined in to repel the Russian attack. As a result of the battle, the enemy lost 3 armored vehicles destroyed, 3 drowned, and most of their infantry were wiped out. Nevertheless, the Russian army does not give up hope of breaking through our defenses somewhere along the front, at any cost, even if it means hundreds or thousands of their soldiers killed.
Every day, essentially, there is news that the armed forces have pushed the enemy out in one area or liberated territory in another. In all directions, they are basically repelling large-scale enemy attacks. Every day, dozens of attacks are carried out along the front lines.
The enemy is especially desperate to drive the Ukrainian armed forces out of Pokrovsk. Enemy sabotage groups have been storming the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces there around the clock, without stopping for the past several days. The situation in this direction remains extremely difficult for the Ukrainian armed forces. Nevertheless, despite all the enemy's efforts, our defenders are bravely holding the defense of Pokrovsk.
The defense of Pokrovsk has been holding for over a year now. More than a year, just think about that. So how many thousands of Russians have died there? Losses exceed 200,000. These are the official confirmed losses according to figures from foreign intelligence agencies. Here's another point. How much Russian equipment have Russian generals lost in this direction? The generals have lost their epaulets.
The Pokrovsk direction is the main topic of conversation for Russian propaganda. But when it comes to their so-called achievements on other sections of the front, Kremlin propaganda prefers not to talk about them. You're unlikely to see footage like this on TV across the border. Within minutes of spotting the enemy, the border guards from the PLA Brigade's reconnaissance strike group completely destroy yet another enemy position. As a result, the occupiers lost at least 2 of their tanks, a vehicle, an antenna, electronic warfare equipment, and a significant portion of their personnel in the southern Slobozhansky direction.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Despite all their efforts, the Russians have not managed to achieve a single significant victory, either on the ground or in the air. The only thing the occupiers are really good at is creating weapons of mass. Civilian terror. A vivid example of this is the barbaric raid on wind turbines near Kramatorsk. These are clearly civilian critical infrastructure facilities. In this way, the Russians destroyed a 3rd wind power station in Kramatorsk. Before this, the occupiers attacked wind turbines on October 22nd and 24th. Endless air raids on Ukrainian cities may become the Kremlin's new tactic. To this end, Russia is actively testing more and more new types of its own drones. For example, UAVs with a ring wing. An unusual enemy drone was detected by a Ukrainian anti-aircraft drone. Its exact purpose has not yet been determined. However, it is assumed that it could have performed both reconnaissance as well as strike missions. Overall, just in the past week alone, the enemy sent at least 1,200 UAVs towards Ukraine, dropped more than 1,360 glide bombs, and used over 50 missiles of various types.
Every Russian strike is an attempt to inflict as much harm as possible on everyday life. This week, these are strikes on residential buildings, on our people, on children, on civilian infrastructure. This is the main target for the Russians. Thousands of strikes with various types of weapons in just 1 week.
However, military analysts assure that Ukraine's response to Russian terror is also not far off.
Ukraine was, is, and will be. And sooner or later, Ukrainian Tomahawks will definitely meet the Russian decision-making centers. And
while American Tomahawks are still on their way, the security service of Ukraine has shown off its own new upgrades.
I am handing over this wonderful Magura B7, which has already achieved a number of victories.
The drone was purchased with donations from Ukrainians as part of a large-scale fundraising campaign, which was joined by local artists, influencers, and athletes.
This strike by a naval drone is the first in the world to have destroyed aerial targets.
Thanks to just one such naval drone, the occupiers can suffer colossal losses, which the security service of Ukraine promises to report in their upcoming video updates.
The battles for control over the city of Kupiansk, a major transportation hub in the Kharkiv region, are ongoing.
The situation in Kupiansk remains difficult, but these days our forces have more control. We continue to defend our positions.
Against this backdrop, Russian propaganda has once again released another batch of fake news. The bunker dweller claimed that Ukrainian troops in Kupiansk are not surrounded.
And as a result, access has been denied and is now completely blocked, meaning you are unable to continue or proceed any further at this time. The editor of the subtitles, A. Semkin, as well as the proofreader, A. Igorova, both suggested the idea of sending representatives of the media, including both foreign journalists and Ukrainian journalists, directly into the enemy's encirclement zone. This was proposed so that these individuals could personally go in and see with their own eyes exactly what is happening there, and so that they could observe for themselves the true condition and situation of the encircled Ukrainian troops. Furthermore, this was intended to ensure that the political leadership of Ukraine would be able to make the most appropriate and well-informed decisions regarding the fate and future of its citizens, as well as its military personnel, based on accurate and first-hand information.
But these statements have nothing to do with reality. This is the painfully familiar old Kremlin tactic: media blackmail and an attempt to demoralize Ukrainian society.
As of today, I believe the situation has been stabilized. I hope that our security and defense forces will be able to do everything to ensure that Kupiansk is not captured by the enemy.
In reality, this is not an encirclement, but rather heavy local fighting.
The main direction of the occupiers' attack is not Kupiansk itself, but Kupiansk-Vuzlovye. The occupiers' plans include the possibility of establishing control over this key railway station.
As of October 30th, Ukrainian forces maintain control over most of Kupiansk and key transportation hubs. Russian occupiers have entrenched themselves in small groups on the northern outskirts of the city and in the western part, creating a foothold for further attempts at an offensive.
In other words, they are trying to change their tactics and strategy of combat operations in urban environments. It is fundamentally different from the tactics used in Bakhmut 2.5 years ago, when the occupiers deployed a large amount of armored vehicles and accordingly the so-called local assault tactics to establish control over this settlement.
The main threat remains the northern directions and the enemy's attempts to break through to the Kharkiv-Kupiansk-Svatova highway. This route is vital for supplying Ukrainian units on the eastern bank of the Oskil. From the south and east, Russian forces have been unable to approach the city. The main supply route for the Ukrainian armed forces remains through the Kupiansk-Vuzlovye railway station and the embankment dam across the Oskil. The dam is periodically subjected to enemy airstrikes but remains operational, while pontoon crossings serve as backup routes.
In other words, the main goal and strategic objective of the occupiers is not to advance deeper into Kharkiv region, but to repeat the scenario of 1922, when the Izium grouping of the occupiers was considered one of the most combat-capable and aimed to achieve the operational encirclement of Ukrainian units precisely in the area of the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration. This is the main goal. In other words, the strategic objective of the occupiers is to establish full control over the territory of Donetsk region.
But the enemy has run into the tough defense of the Ukrainian armed forces. Counterattacks by Ukrainian troops are holding back the Russian advance.
At the moment, Ukraine's defense forces are conducting counter-sabotage operations to prevent the penetration of Russian occupiers further into the urban area and directly towards gaining control over the key hub of Kupiansk.
Kupiansk is not just another point on the map, it is a symbol of resilience, endurance, and military stamina. The Russian army is trying to wear the city down, but the Ukrainian defense is holding strong. And no matter how much the Kremlin tries to pass off wishful thinking as reality, the truth is on the side of those who are defending their home. And step by step, they are driving the enemy out of Ukrainian land.